Okay, so we're going to start off with a little bit of a primer because I find that when teaching these concepts of copyright law, it's not that I want you to need to know the law, but it's good to get a general foundation to kind of create a framework for these things. So in general, copyright is a series of federal laws, and like anything in law, the whole point is a balancing act. You're trying to balance two competing interests. So with copyright, on one side, you're you're balancing the right of authors who want to protect and monetize their work. And then on the other hand, and ignore that for just a second. On the other hand, you're balancing the rights of the public who want access to that knowledge and information. And in doing so, we advance society. So under the construct of the law, we call these two things exclusive rights and limitations. So basically, and we'll get to that in a second, but copyright in this balance applies to fixed creative works, including still and moving images. So copyright applies to all of the photos and images you want to use, but as we noted, these exclusive rights apply to those copyrighted works, okay? So those authors, those copyright owners have the exclusive rights, and you might be able to use some for free because there are limitations on those rights. If we skip ahead a little bit, the exclusive rights of copyright owners as they relate to the work that you would do. So these are the things that only the copyright owner of a work can do, are making reproductions, distributing the work, publicly displaying, publicly performing, and creating derivatives. And there's some examples there below each item of what that means in our academic setting or in the setting in general. Making copies, handing them out to people, showing them publicly online at presentations, and then creating derivatives is really making something based on the original and just changing it a little bit. So those are all of the things that copyright owners can do. So basically, copyright owners have all the power over their work, and that makes sense because they're the ones who put the time and energy into it. On the other hand, Congress has created a bunch of limitations on those rights. We'll talk about those in just a second. So if you want to use a copyrighted work, you have to get permission unless you're the copyright owner, in which case you give yourself permission. You don't need to seek permission. There's a limitation that applies, which we'll talk about in a minute. The work is in the public domain, which means it no longer has a copyright protection. Or the work has an applicable Creative Commons license, and we'll get into that in greater detail also. So the limitations I talked about, there's different types. There's statutory limitations, and those are limitations that are written into law by Congress. Now, I've listed a bunch there. The grayed out ones are ones that you may have heard of working in an academic institution, but we're not going to focus on here. The ones that are primarily of interest to all of you would be the public domain and fair use, and we'll look at those in greater detail. And then contractual limitations are contracts between the rights owner, the copyright owner, and an individual. And so that's where you get into getting permissions, because getting permissions is really a contractual agreement where you're working with the copyright owner to come to an agreement on how to use a work. And so examples of those are licensing agreements, which we'll talk about. And again, the grayed out area, publishing agreements, academic agreements, things that you may have heard about in your context working at an institution, of higher ed, but things that we're not going to focus on here today. And I can't see if there are questions. My screen's not showing the chat. So if any questions do pop up, can someone just interrupt me and let me know?
Sure, will do. Nothing so far.
Okay, and please interrupt with questions if you have any. I hope I'm not going too fast. I hope everybody's following along just fine.
So far, so good.
Okay, so on the statutory limitations, we talk about the public domain. And really what that is that a work is no longer protected by copyright. And so generally speaking, if a work is from before 1923, it's in the public domain. If it's from before 1989 and there's no copyright notice, which is that little C with a circle around it, that symbol, then it's in the public domain. And then we also have some other tools. There's the Cornell Public Domain Chart, and this can get confusing. We often get questions about it. but as you can see, this is why a lot of times when we get copyright inquiries, it takes a lot of going back and forth and asking questions, because these are all conditions under which to determine if a work is in the public domain in the United States right now. So there's a lot of different combinations and considerations, but that's one resource. And then let me figure out how to get back to that presentation.
I think you might just be sharing the presentation itself, so we didn't see the...
Oh, you didn't see the link. Okay. All right, 1 second. Okay. Well, the links are there, and then there's also another resource you can use, Copyright Digital Cider. The link is, the links are spelled out on the last slide of the presentation, so it's not like you just see the name of it. Other public domain works are works that were never protected by copyright. So many government works, most government works. And so NOAA and NASA in particular have amazing images that are all public and all available for free. They take pictures from space, of just crazy things, of weather, of parks, of all sorts of stuff. So there's a lot of resources there for free. And then Marcia, if you want to take over on this, Marcia's created a guide to finding visual resources, and she can talk about that.
Thanks, Amy. I usually tell people that a lot of government images are in the public domain. Do you think that's a fair thing to be saying to people? Like, not?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, but those are really aesthetically, like, really aesthetic images.
Yeah, and I think the line is, the line is usually with that, to be mindful of things that come from places like NARA or presidential libraries, because even though they're held there and might be government images, because of the particularities of those institutions, those might still have active copyright that is and not be under public domain. So it's, most of the time, government sources, thumbs up, good to go. But just be mindful that, there's always an exception to the rule, and that you make no assumptions, but just use these guidelines.
Right, that sounds good. So I have this guide that I created with my colleague Suzette Newberry, who's the history of art librarian, just about finding images for all kinds of different use case scenarios. And when I last talked to CCE in 2016 with different colleagues, or I guess Chloe was there and Amy was there too, this guide was something that you guys had circulated already. Is it still something that you guys use or ever look at?
We do have a link to it from our kind of staff site page. So it's still listed as one of our resources, definitely.
Okay, well, without going, I think we're going to have a lot of, Amy has a lot of slides and a lot of really good information to go through. So I'm not going to go through the guide very thoroughly, but basically there are different tabs to look for stock images and fee-based images, image databases that we have at Cornell that may or may not be useful. They're pretty heavily based in art and architecture. We also have a lot of Cornell-specific image collections. I guess so often it's hard to talk about general places to find images, but two that we talk about a lot are Flickr Commons, and also Wikimedia Commons are good sources. But if you guys have images that you're looking for in particular, you should just really feel comfortable reaching out to me, because it's the best part of my job when people say to me, I need this image. And I really love the challenge of it, and we can work together to try to figure out what you need and what might work. So I guess that's all I really wanted to say. If you guys have specific questions later on about finding certain images, we could talk about that. Yeah. So I think we could go to the next slide.
Okay. So fair use. This series of slides goes really in depth. I might kind of fly through it a little bit because it can be really redundant, but it's good to have the information in the slides, because if you retain the slides and go back, and I can send these to you so you can distribute them if you want. But I find it's good to have the detail on slides for reference later on. So just keep that in mind. So fair use is a common way for educators and scholars to balance the use of copyright protected content. But it's a case-by-case analysis, and it's very nuanced. It really depends on every single fact. So as a policy, Cornell Counsel's Office does not permit my office, Copyright Information Center, to make fair use determinations for anyone. You have to make the determination yourself because it's so fact-specific and you know the particulars of your intended use. We do, however, produce a copyright checklist, a fair use checklist. It's available on our website. You can just Google Cornell fair use checklist and it'll come up, and it will show you all of the considerations as to whether fair use applies or not. And it's pretty handy. So there are 4 factors when you're considering fair use, and none of them, it's not like if you have, that there's a criteria of if you have 3 out of 4, you're required to have 4 out of 4. It's really a balancing act, like everything in law. So it just kind of depends on which way it tipped, what is the majority of all the factors. So the first is the purpose and character of your use. The next is the nature of the copyrighted work that you want to use, the amount and substantiality of the portion you want to use, and the effect of your use upon the market. So to go a little deeper, the purpose and character of your use, if it's educational, teaching, research, scholarship, comment and criticism, if it's nonprofit, those weigh in favor of fair use. If your use is transformative, so if you're changing the work to serve a new purpose, you're not just taking it verbatim, but you're making some sort of modification, that's helpful. But if it's a strictly commercial or entertainment use, you're just using a verbatim copy and you're trying to generate a profit, that weighs against fair use.
Hey, Amy?
Yeah?
Is there an example of an image, since we're talking about that, being transformed that you might be able to, just to pluck out of the air as an example?
Oh, I'm trying to think. If you have an example off the top of your head, you can feel free.
Did Richard Prince, the Richard Prince one?
That's kind of what I was thinking of. So I was thinking about what's the easiest way to describe that. Richard Prince is an artist who would take, so for instance, he took images of people from some of the Caribbean islands and then transformed them by drawing on them and changing what the image was and what the perception of it was. And that was deemed to be a fair use. That's not me. And Marsha, Richard Prince has a lot of examples of fair use. Do you want to talk about some others? Oh, your mic is off.
Oh, thank you. I think that's a good example. It's really hard to talk about them without seeing images.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I could send you some examples of his images. He also did a whole series appropriating Marlboro ads with the cowboys, and I guess I actually don't know his work that well. He's sort of like a trickster. He creates exhibition catalogs with no text and this sort of thing. So I
think maybe it's enough to say, and there's lots of, if people are wondering, you can always ask the copyright inbox. But think of, if you're just cropping an image, that's not transforming it. So think about, these are more robust approaches.
Substantial changes.
Yeah. So just keep that in mind as part of the consideration.
Yep. Good point. The nature of the copyrighted work, the second factor is if the underlying work is factual, nonfiction, news, if it's published, all of those factors weigh in favor of fair use, because the less creativity that goes into an original work, it's still protected, but it's on the lower side of protection of copyright. if that makes any sense. And if a work's been published, then the author, the copyright owner, has had the opportunity to monetize it. So that weighs in favor of copyright or of fair use. Whereas if it's not been published yet, and if it's creative work, then those things we want to protect a little more. We want those people who really put a lot of time and creativity into their work to really be able to benefit from them. And especially if their work is unpublished, we want them to have the first shot at publishing their work and monetizing and benefiting from their hard work. The third factor is the amount and substantiality of the portion you want to use. So this can get a little bit tricky, but basically if you want to use a small quantity or a portion that's not the entire work or central to the entire work, that weighs in favor of fair use. But if you want to use the whole thing or a large portion, that doesn't work. It also doesn't work if you want to take what's the heart of the work. So that's to say, you know, perhaps you want to use an image and you only want to use, you want to crop and change use a small portion of that image and change its context, but maybe it's the main focus of the image. Now, again, everything's fact specific, so you'd have to tease it out and, you know, consider everything, but that's just kind of a little example of that. And then finally, the effect of your use on the potential market. So the big point is here, if your use of this image is going to affect the market negatively, so I'll skip ahead to the next slide. If the effect of your use is that somebody else is going to lose out on money, or if you want to make numerous copies and distribute it, and there's a licensing mechanism, then that weighs against fair use. But on the other hand, going back a slide, if your use isn't going to have a significant effect on the market, if you're only going to do one or a couple copies, it's not in print anymore, there's no way to license it, things like that, that weighs in favor of fair use. So in summary, I just listed on this last slide, which might be the keeper for everybody, you know, highlighted in green, green means go, the factors that weigh in favor of fair use. If it's educational, nonprofit, you're using fact-based published work, you're only using what's needed, not the heart of the work, and you're not supplanting the commercial content, commercial market, then it's likely that fair use can be applied to your project, to your use. So those were the two statutory limitations on copyright, so public domain and fair use. And we're gonna move on to contractual limitations, which a couple of these we'll touch upon real quickly. And then after that, Matthew's gonna talk a lot about licensing photos, how to do that, the process, when it's necessary, and those types of things. So Marcia talked earlier about her visual guide and some of the resources that the library contracts with vendors so that we have access to images and other information. So those are institutional licenses where we work with vendors. The library has already paid vendors, so you have access to those things, access to millions of licensed works. So as Marcia already offered, you can work with her to determine what our level of access is, you know, if there's an image in particular you want, whether we already license it and you could use it for free. And then there are private agreements. Creative Commons is really a private agreement between the creator of a work and the public. And then there's the whole permissions process. So Creative Commons, I'm not going to go over all of this in great detail, but you can see that basically, if you are a content creator, you can apply one of these 6 licenses to your work. And by doing so, you tell the public that they can use your work, but under certain conditions. So from the least restrictive is all the way to the top left, where others can use your work, they can modify it. You just have to attribute it to them. And then on the bottom right is the most restrictive, where others can use your work, but only for a non-commercial purpose. They have to attribute to you, and you can't modify it, make derivatives, you can't charge, nothing like that. And then the 4 in the middle are different combinations thereof. Some people might just want attribution, some people might want attribution and you can't modify it. Some people might say you can modify it, but you can't charge, etc. So you just find what you look for the images, and again, there are a whole host of Creative Commons image libraries online, and you look for that code, that little graphic, and it will tell you what you can or can't do with somebody's work.
Amy, before you move on, there was a question that I'm sorry I didn't see for a second about fair use.
Okay.
So it seems like fair use can be kind of difficult to assess. I know you said that you have a checklist, but can your office help at all with figuring it out?
Right. So we can't make the final determination, but we can help you weigh the factors and help you come to a conclusion on your own. It's complicated, especially if you've never really seen the factors before, because it's heavy. There's a lot there. But once you get used to working with it, and once you see the fair use chart takes those 4 categories and then puts subcategories underneath each one. And it has literally little check boxes. So it guides you through it and says, under each category, you check everything that applies. And then at the bottom of the checklist, you basically count up how many checks you have on one column versus another one, and whichever one has more will lead you to whether it's a fair use or not. So the checklist is really helpful, but yes, absolutely, we can help people, guide people through that process. We just have to have them make the final determination on their own.
Great, thank you.
Yep, absolutely. So that was, let me flip ahead a little bit. So that was Creative Commons I just wrapped up. So permissions, again, permissions is a license. You are entering into an agreement with the rights owner where you ask for permission, they say yes, and they tell you the terms. So if you don't get permission and you need to, you could face potentially really expensive copyright infringement claims. And I can tell you that the university does get expensive copyright infringement claims. We get letters. We probably get a handful a year from individuals who claim that we have infringed their copyright. And under the law, the statutory framework of copyright law, the penalty for each infringement can be a minimum of $750 up to $1,500 or even more. So it can be quite costly. And so you want to make sure that you have an exception, a limitation, or permission before you use an image. So a few caveats with asking for permission. The rights holder can say no. They can tell you they don't want you to use their work in a particular way. They can also request payment. They can define the terms. So they can say, yes, you can use it in this number of publications for this, or online for this length of time for free. If you want to use it for longer, you have to pay me X amount. They can really call the shots. And they also may not respond. So I'm going to show you in the next few slides a couple examples of permission emails that we send out. In our office, clears a lot of permissions for MOOCs, for massive online open courses through CIT. So we do that, and for some reason, a lot of these faculty members like to use memes for their MOOCs. And so we have found that when we reach out to meme creators, you just find something on Twitter or online somewhere, those meme creators are not necessarily responding. So sometimes you might not get a response. So the process is that you email the rights owner. You just kind of figure out who it is. You email the person. We find it best if you describe the work and you attach or link to a copy of the work. Describe your proposed use. The slide says number of students. That's usually what our audience is, but how the size of your audience, the length of time you want to use it, if it's going to be online, things like that. Ask for complimentary permission, for free permission, because you obviously don't want to pay if you can avoid it. And then retain every attempt and any responses you get, every attempt to get permission and any responses, just so that you have a paper trail or electronic trail of what you've done, so that if there are ever any issues in the future, you can refer back to that. And so I won't read these in great detail, but we have a sample of what you might say to a small corporation or group, and then what you might say to a formal corporate entity. You just write them, say who you're writing on behalf of, you know, links or whatever to introduce it, if that makes sense. Say what your intended use is. So again, this references the MOOCs that we do. It's a 5-week course. It's free and open to anyone. So we're telling them basically how far and wide their image or their product would be seen. And then, you know, there's the highlighted blue language. I request a royalty-free license for the following work. You know, we put in all of the detail. We'll attach a copy of the image or a link. You know, and then we underscore, you know, the program that's doing the MOOC is an educational platform. It's not commercial. We're not making money off of this, etc. You know, people will see it. You'll get some publicity out of it, and please let me know if we can use it. So it's a pretty simple ask. And with that, I'll hand it over to Matthew.
And before that happens, Amy, are those letters, do we have those on the CIC website?
I don't think that we do.
Okay.
But they're, so again, we'll make these slides available to you so that you have the content in the slides. And always feel free to email us. Our email, it's copyright@cornell.edu. It's super simple, and it's listed a couple times, I think, in this presentation.
And if you know, as you're putting those letters together, you know, we can't always do the lift of writing the whole thing for you because our inbox is overflowing. But what we can do is make sure that if you want to, you know, that you have resources to build those letters, and that if you want to send us a draft and help you work through it, we are very more than happy to make sure that you're covered on all fronts.
Yep, absolutely.
So,
and I'll also say some places you may be looking around their website and find that they say, how do I get permission? They may have a form on their website where you just fill in the fields. And if that's the case, just do that. They know what they want out of you. So adhere to what they're asking for, and that's even easier.
You got it. So with this, you'll notice that, and I put the link in the comments here. So when you get the presentation, you'll be able to get more information. But just speaking first about attribution, there are many different ways to cite an image, but in almost all cases, you want something. You want to be able to say where the image is from. It's best practice, whether it's on a flyer that you're distributing or it's on a website. If you're not the owner of that image, then you'll want to make sure that you say where that came from. There are exceptions to that, of course. Sometimes if you license a stock image, you have no attribution responsibility. And you know, those are case by case. But it's always, you know, it's always good to keep in mind, do I need to make attribution? There is a tab on Marcia's fantastic LibGuide on citation that walks you through. I took this general caption screenshot from it as for the presentation. And it walks you through different formats as well, if there are particular academic formats that you need to use, but making sure that you have those basic pieces of information. And, you know, and all of it, you know, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are guides that we have for you to get from point A to point B. The thing that supersedes a lot of this, just like if the stock image has no attribution requirement, if an image that you get permission for, they have a specific permission requirement or attribution requirement, follow the rules. If they say all you have to do is throw a link up there, great, like go with that. But you know, there are other considerations to make later down the line. But as far as just following the letter of the law goes, make sure that you're looking at all of those pieces. Does that all sound good? And before I go any further, are there any more questions in the chat? Just and
I'm seeing.
Come again?
I don't see any new questions in the chat.
Cool. Very good. Can we go to the next slide, Amy? Awesome. So as Amy mentioned before, Creative Commons is a great tool for licensing your own images. If you're creating photographs as part of your job. Now, there's two pieces to this puzzle. You want to make sure that with certain divisions of Cornell or whoever your primary employer is, there may be rules in place about images that you create as part of your job, who owns them and who determines what that license or copyright statement needs to be. So figuring out...
yes. Yeah, it's great.
Oh, the question was, I found the source Unsplash for free images. Are you familiar with it? And so, yes.
It's fantastic. It's really great, especially for sort of more decorative things like backgrounds or just using a piece as.
Yeah, and Pixabay has good stuff too.
Yep.
The Noun Project has good icons, but we'll get into more resources in just a sec. But going back to licenses, I don't, and maybe this is a question that the folks at the administrative in the box with the curtain down there can answer, if there are particular rules about images that are created, photographs that are taken by employees of your division. What happens with those? Is there a ready out of the pocket answer for that?
As far as I understand, RJ, correct me if I'm wrong, each association creates their own rules around that.
Okay, great.
All right.
So that means that you get to, that association, or you as a contractor, depending on what the details of your employment are, get to make that determination. You might just, keep it copyright to the organization, all rights reserved. And while copyright is a good thing and all of those things, it is rather boxy and restrictive at times, and especially because we are in an age and a time where content takes on a life of its own. Being able to clearly stamp something with information makes your life easier. So it might get reused with the considerations that you want in mind, without them having to track you down, just like Amy was talking about, you having to track other people down. So, going through and the Creative Commons website, again, it's linked off screen, but you'll be able to get there. And they have a very, very simple and intuitive process to talk you through what you want somebody to be able to do with the photograph you take. Is there a question?
Yeah, so when you go through the process of Creative Commons licensing, does that make it show up when people are searching for Creative Commons licensed photos in like Google Images?
No, but I have slides for that.
Oh, okay.
So we'll get there in a sec. But that's just the broader, here is part of the process. Amy, you want to advance me forward? Awesome. So, the other pieces of that are captioning the image accordingly, saying, this image available by Creative Commons license, and you'll be able to get, if this is online, you'll be able to get the icon and some code to embed with the image, or just on your page, your association webpage. You might want to put a CC by NC so that people can use it without as long as they're not doing something commercial, or whatever the combination might be. But making sure that that image has information with it, that if appropriate and possible, that you use the HTML that's generated by that process on the page. If you're using print materials, just putting it just like that little copyright C will, if you put that on any sort of print material, it's instantly visible. People know what that means, and there's protection in place. Putting the Creative Commons symbol on there does the same thing. It tells people this is the circumstance where you can use it, and here are the basic rules around that use. The other thing you can do is, in the digital part of the realm, is host it on platforms that support licenses. Wikimedia Commons and Flickr, and I think there's another one that Wikimedia Commons talks about, 500 pixels, I think it's called, or something like that, are all platforms that have a licensing function built in to the hosting. So what you're doing is you're putting it into your image, your photographs, into a public collection, and you are putting in details about those images, and you're saying explicitly, here are the reuse functions. That's different than going through the Creative Commons website, because it sounds, Creative Commons is often a confusing name because it sounds like it is itself a repository, but it is not. It is a system for licensing, whereas Wikimedia Commons or Flickr Commons are themselves things that hold images inside them. So putting them there and making sure that you indicate your what license you are choosing and the instances where you would allow reuse puts that there. And because it's encoded in that repository in a way that is much harder for us to do, even if you have your own website, it's much, much harder to do to make it machine readable for those search engines. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But those are the, making sure that you have clear statements, making sure that you have the appropriate symbols associated with them, and making sure that you have captions that are appropriate are the best ways to show the license that you want for the images you or your organization is creating. I know I talk fast sometimes, so I want to pause each time and make sure and see if there are any questions. All good? Cool. Let's move on forward. So here you'll see, this is a screenshot from Wikimedia Commons, their upload wizard. Very simple. Take an image, pop it in, you make that assertion, the copyright holder for this work, irrevocably grant the right to anyone to use this work under the Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike license. So, and then you can choose a different license and you can proceed. So it's a very basic process. And that way having it on a platform like this is what makes it discoverable by search engines, because the technology that they're using to kind of store that data around your image is readable by the search engines in a way that's a little bit difficult to put together. Unfortunately, a little bit more difficult than just putting the embed code on the page, although that does help. Let's move on forward. And I know that hopefully I'm not getting too technical, and these are basic steps, but if I am and anything needs explained, please let me know and I will back up. So how do search engines determine the license status of a photo? Continuing on that theme. Unless the image has those explicit instructions attached to it, copyright is assumed. So if you're in Google and you are looking at images, it's showing you a mix of images that are under copyright and images that have that license embedded with the image. If you restrict it down to images free to reuse, it's going to show you images that have that data. That's still not a definitive way of determining the right status of that image, but at least it points you in a better direction if you're looking for rights-free images. The ability to read a Creative Commons license or public domain mark easily it's an encoding issue. It's not something that's easily replicated, but having the CC embed code on your website in general or next to an image it can get picked up that way. It's not a guarantee, but it can, and it certainly helps people who are shopping around looking for images and might want to reuse them, because then they'll have some context for what your rules are. And I think that's it for this slide. Okay. We're talking about using some code, and the question was submitted, what is meta tagging? Should I use it? And if so, how? This is a question that can mean a lot of different things. So I'm going to cover a couple of them, and after I get through, if people say, well, I was actually thinking of this other thing, because I'm certainly not exhaustive here, we can talk about that as well. Tagging is important. You should do it with images online. It helps SEO, which is search engine optimization. It helps making sure that those images become discoverable to people who are looking for them. Making sure an image of a dog can be seen as an image of a dog means that it's been tagged as an image of a dog. So that's helpful for people who have accessibility challenges, as well as those as Google and Bing who are looking for the different resources. Finally, and there's a link to this in the comments of this slide, Cornell does have accessibility standards that must be adhered to whenever possible. So if you were affiliated with Cornell directly, it's good to look at those. If you're not affiliated with Cornell directly, it's good to look at those. Making an accessible web makes the web healthier and stronger, makes those resources, again, more discoverable, and make sure that you're able to serve the entirety of your service population. Let's go to the next one. So here's often what comes to mind: code. Now, this is the the puppy is cute, but the code is ugly. So if you're using a website platform like WordPress, then that might it might simplify the process. If you're doing HTML, then there are bits and pieces, but you can see there the basics of it, that it's looking at a picture. It's got that alt text, which says what's in the picture, and then it's got a caption of what's going on so that a machine can read through that. That means that it can be discovered, and that means that somebody who's using screen reader technology, for example, is able to understand what's there without a guess. So there's a lot of different rules and guidelines and solutions. There is that link at the bottom of the page, as well as another one in the comments. It's very interesting and plain language material to kind of look through to understand what this kind of background behind the curtain stuff does for images. And this is, while it's helpful for licensing or for accessibility and discoverability, being able to put licensing information in there can happen as well. You can say in that alt text, copyright Amy Diger 2018, and that's a great place to put it, because at least it's somewhere. It's somewhere associated with that page and that image. Let's go next. So another way of tagging an image is the EXIF data. It's a long acronym that I can't remember right now. But EXIF data is a great first step whenever you're creating images. The only problem is that anybody can remove it, because you've got an image and then you've got kind of this little bit of data on the side that's describing that image, but it's not inherently part of the file itself. So in that, you'll be able to edit things like title, subject. If you can put in a copyright notice or a Creative Commons notice. It should also be known that if you're using a cell phone camera, for example, each of the pictures that you take is encoded with the date and time, the place, the type of camera that you used, sometimes the application, as well as the dimensions of the picture. So if you're concerned about privacy, that's certainly something to keep in mind with the images that you're taking on cell phone cameras, and sometimes on nicer commercial cameras as well. But it's things that you can go in and very simply edit. If you're in Windows, you can right-click on an image, go to Properties, and then Details. And there it is, and you can just go ahead and edit away. I put a link in the comments to this slide as well to how to do that and how to do it on Mac computers as well. In addition to being a great first step to being able to license your own images, it's a good thing to do when you grab an image. If you get an image from somewhere and you're curious about it, or you want to make sure that there's nothing in there that is at all inappropriate for the circumstance or whatever it is, take a look. Somebody could have copyrighted the image 2 users ago, and that makes a question about whether it's up for grabs. It might have been cleared out because it's really easy to remove all that data as well. But it's not, for a half a second to take a peek, it's a pretty good idea. And it can also provide valuable data like the dimensions of the image in case you need to resize it,
Yeah.
or in case you need to go back and request a larger size. So that's another way of tagging an image. Finally, there's watermarking. I was luckily able to find a Getty image of David Lynch, because who doesn't always want to think about David Lynch? We've got, when we think of watermarking, we often think of this very blatant on the picture. It's what comes up often when we're looking for people or things on Google search. Or getting images from a museum or some stock photo collection. Those big watermarks. Now, first, they're not great to use. Yes, you can use them, and you can use Photoshop to apply a watermark. They make the web a little bit more difficult to navigate, and they make your life more difficult to navigate because you have to balance two different versions. So if you're not worried about or trying to monetize images, doing something simpler, making sure it's in the background or in a caption, again, near the context of your image, might be an easier way to go. If you're using images, just because you don't see a watermark doesn't mean that it's fair game. And so, this is the one, the overt one that we're used to seeing. Amy, can you go to the next one, please? So there are tools like Digimarc that allow users to apply nearly indistinguishable watermarks. And that, that if you downsize it, doesn't matter. It's going to be retained in the image, and you'll never be able. It's invisible to the human eye. It's something that's only really computer readable. So thinking about that, if you're like, I think I can get away with this, you may be, but maybe not. Likewise, if you want to make your images available but don't want the kind of gaudy, visible, big watermark, but you just want to be able to tag it. Here's a tool. It does cost, but it's not a huge cost that can be used to make sure that you're keeping ownership of your intellectual property for you or your division. Yeah. Okay. I think that's all I got on those fronts. Hopefully, I didn't bore everybody to tears.
No, that was really great. I learned a lot. I jotted
Are there
down.
any questions?
I don't see any in the chat, but please feel free to shout out questions to anyone or type them in the chat. I thought of a couple questions that I had while you were presenting. So the Widen digital asset management library thing, are there licensing contracts within that? Do you know how that works? If we add photos there or get photos from that?
Yeah, I mean, with the images that I've seen on Widen, they all have terms of use, so you could probably figure out how to make sure that your photos can only be used in certain ways through their sort of metadata scheme.
Okay, and do you know if they have like a Creative Commons option? Because I know it's behind, like you have to use your NetID to get to it, so
Yeah.
about that.
I don't know if they do. Before you download an image, they ask you how you're using it, and the categories are pretty specific.
Yeah.
But I need to go into Widen to see if there was any if there was any completely open license that people could use them as fair use.
Okay.
I'd have to get back to you.
Yeah, that would be great, because I've only used it to download things. I've never uploaded anything, so I was just curious about that.
Yeah.
So this was a question that came in. Oh, there's a question in the chat. Do you have examples of copyright statements put on CCE websites or Facebook pages? Not sure that I fully
You won't be able to apply a copyright license to anything posted there, really. While you and part of that is the complications of the terms of use of the platform, because you not only sign over your rights, you're in a lot of ways signing over the rights to those materials themselves. So do keep that in mind as you're uploading things. If there are photographs that you want to be able to otherwise monetize, Facebook is not a great place to store them.
Great.
I don't know if we, for the CCE side of that, Amy, do you know?
I don't. I guess I was a little unclear on the question.
Yeah, it seems, I mean, so each association has their own website, and it seems like from what you just said, Matthew, it's not a great idea to embed a copyright statement for the website as a whole, because there's going to be elements of it that you might not want to give a blanket copyright statement to. Is that right?
Oh, no, not necessarily. I think that, coming up with an organizational rights statement is a great idea. And if you click at the bottom of most of the regular Cornell statements or pages, you'll see the general copyright statement for Cornell properties. There are simpler ones than that, certainly, as well as more complex ones. Likewise, using a commons license for that is not a bad idea. But it's all about what your organization wants to keep ownership of and what they don't. If there's a white paper that you folks put out, or a newsletter, and you want that to be different than the website itself, then make sure that document, that PDF, has a different mark on it, and that certainly would supersede something above it. So it's about being detailed, and it's, as Amy and I often will say, it's it's case by case. So the main CCE site does not have a site. I wouldn't for CCE. I don't know.
Yeah, and you might even consider coming up with a general statement for all of CCE or for your individual branches or whatnot. And then in that statement also saying that individual policies may vary, or the policy with regard to individual items may vary, and that whatever is stated on that image, that brochure, that paper, whatever, that rules. That way you have a general statement for everything, but if you want to be more particular about something, you've alerted people in the general statement that might happen, that might be the case, and they should look for that.
Okay, so Heather just put in the chat some information about the Cornell copyright statement that people can check out. And she reminded me that I only have this room for another 3 minutes. So I encourage everyone that's on to send any questions that you have to the CCE Communications mailbox, and we can get those questions to Amy and Marcia and Matthew as appropriate. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was beyond my expectations, truly. I learned a lot, and I think probably everyone on the call did as well. And for those of you on the call, I will be working on updating the photo licensing page that's on the staff site. So if you have resources that you use that you really like, definitely send those to me, and I will be sure to include a variety of sources and information for everyone there, including all of those that you all gave us today. So thanks again. I don't think we have a lot of time for more questions, so we're just going to cut it here. But again, please reach out with questions to me, and I'll field them to Amy and team. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.